Hi, everyone. This is Latoya from Amana Bible Institute. We're just going to have a webinar here on Kings. Just give me a moment to share to my pages and we'll go ahead and get started. While I'm sharing, please do also share and help us spread the word that we are live talking about Kings today. We are here on Facebook Live and YouTube Live. So you can watch us either way or share to either pages. Just give me a moment here so we can make sure that people know that we're live. Where's mine? Okay, everyone. Help us share this once again. I'm just going to pull up our YouTube feed here so that we can be in those comments. And I do want to reiterate, as I often do, that these are not just live on social media platforms, but we also have a live classroom here on Zoom. So feel free to come into a live classroom if you want to be more personable and and if you have direct questions that you'd like to voice. But we'll go ahead and begin. Okay. So one of the things that's really, really central in what we're going to be discussing today is this is a part of our Interpretation Matters series here at Amana Bible Institute. We're really big on interpretation and perspective. It is really important that we help you to understand how very important it is to acknowledge your own biases, acknowledge the assumptions that you come to the text with. And in that case, it's really important that we educate you on some of the cultural, the historical, the social backgrounds of the communities that these texts discuss so that you can understand some of the biases that they had and some of the underlying assumptions they might have had when they approached these texts as well. So and I mean, when they heard some of these things, experienced some of these things, because when you're talking about approaching text and for an ancient audience, the Bible quite isn't the Bible that we see today. Nonetheless, today we're going to be talking about kings, good or bad. And for the most part, people think that kings are a good thing. And the Bible is actually quite conflicted on whether we like kings or not. Another thing that's really apparent in all of this is that there is kind of, in some ways, a battle between kingdoms, battle between perspectives. There are things that are at play here that we as modern readers don't often understand when we approach these texts, like the art of writing history, the art of storytelling. And there are multiple perspectives of God that sometimes are conflicting and have some tension between them. And so we're going to be discussing quite a bit today to help you to understand the Bible's perspective of kings. Now we're talking about kings, where the only places where we find a huge critique of kings is really in the Old Testament. So we're not going to be touching the New Testament all today. We're just going to stay in the Hebrew Bible. And in order to do this, I have to contextualize this for you. And I'm going to do that as briefly as I can. But I do want to let you know that if you are interested in this kind of stuff, there's always a class or two, actually a few classes on this bit of history in the Introduction to the Hebrew Bible course. We are going to be offering that course this August. I believe it starts around that week of the August 1st, maybe on August 1st even. And it is a 12-week class. We're going to go through the entire Old Testament for the most part. There are going to be some books that we omit because it's massive. And teaching that in 12 sessions, it's already impossible, but you will come out of the class having a very strong understanding of the Hebrew Bible and having a really strong understanding of the context within the text. If anything, that's what you will certainly grow to have a strong understanding of. And then we will leave it to you to really just struggle and to wrestle with the text, to think through how these texts have meaning for us today. We do some of that in class, but it is a survey course, so we leave it up to our other courses to help you continue that wrestling. That course starts August 1st, ends sometime in October, and it's a 12-week course. So right now it is rated at, I believe, $180, though you can start paying it at a cheaper price by actually enrolling in a Grow plan or a certificate plan. And if you're interested in learning more about that, we'll talk more about that at the end of the session. And you can also send us an email or live chat our website, and we can discuss that as well. So let's contextualize this. First off, you cannot talk about kings without talking about the book of Deuteronomy. And this is why. A lot of people think of the Torah, the first 5 books of Moses, as 5 books written by Moses. And that viewpoint often underestimates all of the other beautiful things that's going on in the text, including its own tensions and including its prophetic nature. It is fairly believed by most scholars that these texts, the Torah was most likely certain aspects of them, carried on history from, thousands of years. But a huge chunk of it, especially the book of Deuteronomy, was written quite late, right? Way after the events that are narrated in it. And there's a reason why. You can see aspects of this book written and thought about, discerned, considered throughout many of the books of the Hebrew Bible. And while it might feel like it starts in Deuteronomy, it certainly doesn't end until you're done with the Hebrew Bible, if you really think about it. So when we're talking about the book of Deuteronomy, we're talking about the second law. It is a reiteration of the law that was already given in earlier books of the Torah, like Exodus. And what we find here is some form of a book of foreshadowing events and sermons. This is what's going to happen if you don't do this. You will experience this or that if you do that, right? And what we see in the history that follows Deuteronomy is the people doing the things that Deuteronomy is telling them not to do. And this in one way is saying, hey, look what's going to happen. We're preparing you for that big exile that is predicted in the book of Deuteronomy. So it's really important to understand the book as a whole. I'm not going to give you a full-on class on Deuteronomy here today, but there is a class on it in Old Testament, Intro to Old Testament. So do take that course. You can just register for that session for a small price if you are I think it's like $15 for just one session, if you're just interested in that particular book. Another thing that is important here in history is exile. The exile is a catastrophic event for the Israelites, for the ancient Israelites. And one of the things that's really important in the exile, or why people are experiencing exile, is to think through why it happened. Why did God allow us to be stripped from our land? Why did God allow the temple to be destroyed? What happened with God when the temple was destroyed? Did God die? Right? Or did God stay in a destroyed land? And it is the history that leads up to the exile, letting you know why exile happened. And it is the books of the prophets that in one way or another provides rationale as to not only why exile happened, but how God responds to it, and that God is very much still alive, very much still faithful to the Davidic promise, and very much has in heart the restoration of the people. Which brings us to another thing. Hope and restoration is not just in the books of the prophets, it's not just in the Psalms and wisdom literature, it is also in history. And we find this type of rewritten history in Chronicles, and it is written in so many ways with this need and this aim to instill hope in the people. So we'll talk a little bit about that here, just a little bit. So Deuteronomy, Deuteros, Namas, right, means second law. In Hebrew, Debarim, meaning words. And that's what it's full of, really important words. The idea is people are not listening to the words within Deuteronomy. They're not doing the things that are central to Deuteronomy, and exile happens as a result of it. And in so many ways, we can actually read our own history and our own accounts, our own actions through the book of Deuteronomy as well, and foreshadow or consider, think of through rationales as to why so many things are happening around us as well, if we wanted to take part in an activity like that, right? Not necessarily sure whether it will be helpful in any way, but we certainly can, because the book of Deuteronomy allows us, it permits us entry and a ability to do that. So the content of the book, lots of laws, final words of Moses. You can almost think of it as Moses's last hurrah. He pretty much sermonizes. He delivers sermons to the people and then dies. Huge themes, though. There is the centralization of worship. You worship one deity in one place, and there is one people that worship, right? This singularity of God, the singularity of the people, and the singularity of the place where that God is worshiped. Really important. And where do you do that? You do it in the temple or in the tabernacle, right? There is that one place. There is also the importance of memory here. A lot of the things that occur when you don't do Deuteronomy, it is the idea that you just forgot. You didn't remember God's steadfast love. You didn't remember how God delivered you in the past. It's all, the issue with what people experience when they are punished is really just this act of having to be forced to remember, right? And they're often found guilty of not remembering. Last but not least, you have the importance of obedience. Obedience is better than sacrifice. And it is the disobedience of the people that leads to the action that follow. Now, the action that follow is narrated through the Deuteronomistic history. The Deuteronomistic history starts right after the book of Joshua. You can think of it as the books that we consider in the Christian canon the former prophets. So it's Joshua, it's Judges, it's 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. It is not Chronicles, though, you guys. Chronicles is not considered Deuteronomistic history. And it's the books of the prophets. You can, not all of them, but some of them, you can definitely see the hand of a Deuteronomistic historian, someone who was reading and writing or revising or compiling with Deuteronomy in mind. Super important there. So the people are disobedient. They don't follow Deuteronomy, and this is what happens. They go into exile. This leads, one of the things that happens that leads to exile is extreme political unrest. There's constant war. There's constant uh, uh, sieges, which generally results in a lack of resources, death. There are also other things that are happening, famines and things of that nature. And what happens as a result of this? The people seek alliances. Sometimes the people are subdued in war. They become vassals, which means that they have to pay tribute to another nation. And then when they don't pay, or the nation doesn't find them pleasing enough, their rulership pleasing enough, or they're, trying to get from under the thumb of this suzerain, the person over them. Um, there's often forced deportation, there's destruction, and this actually happens to the southern kingdom of Judah. There is not only forced deportation, but there's a destruction of the land, destruction and desecration of the temple. And there are identity conflicts as a result. You can actually read the Bible, especially the Hebrew Bible, through the lens of trauma, and there's so much there. So much you can find, so many identity polemics that are prevalent in the Hebrew Bible itself. Nonetheless, what you also have, and this happens in the northern kingdom, what is called Israel, is you have not only people deported, but you have the land repopulated, occupied by people who do not belong to it. So that brings about identity conflicts as well. So there's some important dates here. We get the destruction of the northern kingdom by the Assyrian Empire. This happens in First Kings, where it's narrated in First Kings. I thought I put the chapter there, but it's First Kings chapter 17, Second Kings, chapter 17, that should say, and it happens in 721 BCE. Then you get the destruction of the southern kingdom by Babylon. This occurs in 2 Kings 24, also narrated in 2 Chronicles 36, and this happens in 586 BCE. You don't have to remember these dates, but they are drilled in my mind because I study this stuff. And they're really important events in the Hebrew Bible in so many ways, giving us the beauty that follows, right? Where would the prophetic text be without these events? You can think about it that way. And the role of prophets is so central in the Hebrew Bible, so very central. But the identification role, this role of reinforcing and giving the people identity, that being some form of mandate tied to the prophetic office, really comes about as a result of the exile. Because as I've mentioned, probably over and over and over so far, is that exile is a catastrophic event, and it is one that resulted in some kind of identity stripping. Everything tied to the people, all of the promises of God to their descendants was tied to a land and to a deity. Think about Abraham, you guys. Think about Moses, right? Tied to a land and a deity, land and temple, land and worship. What gets destroyed? It is their land, it is their God, right? It's their temple. And they have to find a way to reconsider how they worship in a new place, a place that is not theirs, and without a temple. So you find all of these beautiful alternatives as a result of it. So what happens after this time of exile? I've already mentioned it. The prophets come on in, saving the day, offering in so many ways hope and restoration. But before you find the hope and restoration, you got to come into the rationale. And the prophets are pretty harsh with that rationale. Then there's the power of lament. You find this in the books of Psalms. You find this in prophets like Jeremiah. Full of lamentations there. And you have the book of Lamentations itself. You have wisdom literature. Think about Job, the power of lament in the book of Job. And there's something hopeful and restorative in the ability to lament to God. In so many ways, this becomes our modern way of thinking about a form of prayer. And then you have the art of history writing. How do you tell your story? Storytelling is really, really important. And you see this beauty in storytelling in the Torah, throughout the Torah, but also throughout the Deuteronomistic history, which I've already mentioned is quite lengthy, from Joshua all the way to Second Kings. And then you can see versions of that Deuteronomistic hand throughout the prophets. And of course, you have what is often viewed by many scholars as rewritten history in First and Second Chronicles. So this is actually my second to the last slide, and it's a lot, I know. But I created this chart to kind of help you understand how these books are different. So in this darker blue color, you have 2 Samuel and 1 and 2 Kings. These are books that are part of the Deuteronomistic history. And then in this lighter blue color, I have 1 and 2 Chronicles, which is not the Deuteronomistic history, but is a form of rewritten history. And therefore, it records history very differently than the books that make up the Deuteronomistic history, interested in two different things. That's why history is recorded differently. And sometimes there are narratives that are emphasized. Sometimes there are narratives that are removed. Other times there are narratives that are just lengthier. So I've pulled out a few kings. The reason why I pulled out these kings is because these kings are notoriously viewed by many Christians and by the Bible as either really good or really bad. And I would say by the Bible as, okay, pretty good, but had some rough stuff occur. And if I'm talking about the Christian view, it's often that David and Solomon, they are the bomb. But when you really read the Bible, when you really read the Deuteronomistic history, they screwed up quite a bit. And the Deuteronomistic historian isn't really interested in identifying them as good kings or bad kings, right? He acknowledges their good moments and their bad moments. But there were two kings who can do no wrong according to the Deuteronomistic history. So, and those kings are Hezekiah and Josiah. And the reason why is because Josiah and Hezekiah, they initiate major cultic reforms, while a lot of these kings did things to encourage, idolatry and practices that are against the book of Deuteronomy. It is Hezekiah and Josiah who actually start Deuteronomistic reforms, right? They start trying to clean up the temple, clean up the land, get rid of those high places, and the Deuteronomistic historian is all over it. He's eating it up because they're doing Deuteronomy. Now those other kings, not so much. Manasseh and Jeroboam, for example, idol worship post-reforms. And yeah, the Deuteronomistic historian doesn't like that. You remember Jeroboam and the golden calf narratives, I'm sure. And Manasseh is just as bad. He comes in right after his father Hezekiah, and he builds high places. Hezekiah destroyed them. He stands up and he rebuilds them. And then I have some other kings that are viewed as good in the book of Chronicles. David and Solomon are amazing in Chronicles. So is Jehoshaphat, who also initiates reforms, specifically cultic reforms, and then I have the fall of the kingdoms here. So I'll quickly go through some of this, not all of it, because I don't want to bore you. But what you find in the Deuteronomistic history for David compared to First and Second Chronicles is pretty astronomical. First off, as you see in the Deuteronomistic history, there are 25 chapters on just David and his kingdom, his kingship. But what you find in Chronicles is that there are 19 chapters. And what you have in the Deuteronomistic history is that David is a king who was loved by God, but he has his faults. He sleeps with Bathsheba, gets her husband killed, and his children are a hot mess. He has children who are usurping the throne. That's Absalom and Adonijah. He has one of his sons sleeps with his own sister and then throws her out of his house, leaving her essentially with no bit of, livelihood left, because she sees herself as, in so many ways, stuck in the house of her brother Absalom and unable to affirm her womanhood, because he pushed her out of the land, out of his house, and did not make her a wife. It would have been better if he raped her and then made her a wife, essentially, is the idea. And we talk a little bit about this in the Old Testament class and in courses like Bible Sex and Other Texts, where you get an idea of how people are actually viewing things like marriage, sex, and gender. Nonetheless, his family is a hot mess, and it is actually David's children and their actions who, in so many ways, specifically Solomon's actions, who we love, but it is his actions that led to the division of the kingdom of Israel. There are 12 tribes, and by the end of Solomon's reign, David's lineage only has 2 of the tribes, and 10 of the tribes has succeeded and is being ruled by their own kings. So really rough. You get those narratives in the Deuteronomistic history, but in 1st and 2nd Chronicles, you don't get any of it. You don't get the Bathsheba narrative. You don't get all of the sins and faults of his children. You don't get any of that stuff. You don't get the sieges or the usurps of the throne. You don't get any of that stuff. They, in so many ways, present David and Solomon as amazing people, and constantly ties them to the temple. And in so many ways, constantly ties their success, their wisdom, their prosperity to God, and offers, like, for example, a narrative in 2nd Chronicles thinks of Solomon as being an accepted king, a divinely accepted king by God, by fire consuming the offering that Solomon offers. That is a narrative that is not in the Deuteronomistic history, because the text is more so interested in affirming Solomon, affirming David. We find a lot of that in Deuteronomistic history, though. Solomon does quite a few things. One of the things he does is he heavily taxes the people, and he initiates a labor corvée. He essentially forces people to work to build his stuff, which includes his home, right? He has a draft, but it's not for war. It's for building things. It's for labor. You clearly see this in the Deuteronomistic history, but in 1st and 2nd Chronicles, it's less clear. It pretty much says that he hired workers, but that's clearly not what's happening in Kings. I think Solomon is a great example to think about when we're talking about kings messing up by not doing Deuteronomy. So I want to take you to Deuteronomy chapter 17. This is where we find the rules for your future king in the book of Deuteronomy, things that should not be happening. So it says around verse 14, when you have come into the land that the Lord your God is giving you and have taken possession of it and settled in it, and you say, I will set a king over me, like all the nations that are around me, you may indeed set over you a king from whom the Lord your God will choose. And then later on, it tells you what he can't do. He must not acquire many horses for himself or return the people to Egypt in order to acquire more horses, since the Lord has said to you, you must never return that way again. Egypt enslaved the people. So it's essentially saying this king can't have a lot of horses, wealth, shouldn't be, going crazy over wealth, and should not be submitting the people to slavery in order to acquire more wealth. Sounds just like Solomon, actually, when you think about the Deuteronomistic view of him. And he must not acquire many wives for himself, or else his heart will turn away. Also, silver and gold he must not acquire in great quantity for himself. So the idea is that this king has to be humble, has to remain humble, a person for the people, right? Not one who is invested in his own endeavors. Let's read about what Solomon does. First Kings chapter 11, verse 1, the very first verse. King Solomon loved many foreign women along with the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women from the nations concerning which the Lord has said to the Israelites, you shall not enter into marriage with them, neither shall they with you, for they will surely incline your heart to follow other gods. And Solomon clung to these in love. Among his wives were 700 princesses and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. Another reference I'll read, and there are many others in Chronicles here, or excuse me, in the Deuteronomistic history here that discuss ways in which Solomon messed up. In fact, the entire chapter of 11 is about Solomon's errors. But let's read about what Second Chronicles says. So Second Chronicles also affirms his wealth, but it kind of doesn't suggest that this is a part of a downfall for him. It says in chapter 2, let's do chapter 1 actually, around verse 14. Solomon gathered together chariots and horses. He had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horses, which he stationed in the chariot cities and with the king in Jerusalem. The king made silver and gold as common in Jerusalem as stone, and he made cedar and plentiful as sycamore of the Shephelah. And it talks about how his horses were imported from Egypt. You know, he has the top of the line kind of stuff, super duper wealthy, goes very much against Deuteronomy. But Second Chronicles really doesn't have a huge problem with it. Versus Kings, which emphasizes in so many ways that all of these things are they are part of Solomon's errors. So let's talk about Jeroboam. When Solomon dies, the kingdom splits between Jeroboam, who takes over the northern kingdom. He takes 10 tribes, and Rehoboam, who takes 2, who was the son of Solomon. Rehoboam is not so good of a king, you guys. In fact, he makes it his job to be worse than his father. He pretty much says, you complained about my father, but guess what? I'm worse. And if you think my father killed you, I'm gonna put you so deep in the grave, you won't know who to call. This is what Rehoboam does against the counsel of the elders. He's listening to his buddies, and he's asserting his power in ways that are beyond what his father did. And his father did quite a bit, as I've already reiterated, his father Solomon. So Jeroboam starts off fairly good, kind of called by God in so many ways to take over the northern kingdom. But he messes up because he builds what are viewed by the Deuteronomistic historian as idols and establishes them before the people and says pretty much, hey, these are your gods, worship. What essentially he establishes, which isn't discussed as often when we discuss these texts in church, is, you know, the kingdoms were once one, and everyone had access to the temple that was in Jerusalem, right? But when the kingdom split up, the temple that is in Jerusalem is now in what is called the southern kingdom, Judah. And now the northern people don't have a temple to go to. What Jeroboam establishes are idols, which, and in some ways, some can see them as not so much idols, but more so footstools for God. And he establishes 2 places to worship in the land of Israel that is not the Jerusalem temple, in order to keep the people faithful to northern Israel. Now, this is once again a problem with Deuteronomy, not only because they're opposing any type of idol worship, but because you only worship in one temple, and that is the temple in Jerusalem, right? You know, one place of worship. So Jeroboam, not so much liked by the Deuteromistic history, but um, he's almost completely ignored in so many ways in Chronicles. He's not really important at all. And his idolatry, his act of bringing idolatry into the land is not really noted. First and Second Chronicles doesn't really care much about the northern kings or the northern people. Just really occupied with David and his lineage. So we have Jehoshaphat, fairly good king, but in Kings, he only gets one chapter. He's not really interested in his reign at all, and only cares about how he reacts with or how he relates to Ahab and works with Ahab. Chronicles mentions that, but also mentions how great of a king he was and all of the cultic reforms he initiated, and contrasts him with his sons, who seems to be quite evil in so many ways and do not follow in his good footsteps. But he's completely absent there. Not only is he absent though, but when you think about First and Second Chronicles, they're not really interested in Ahab, Jezebel. That ain't really mentioned, that whole stealing of the vineyard. They don't care about that stuff. In addition to all of that, you miss a lot of the Elijah narratives. Elijah does have a place in Chronicles, but not so much of a place at all. And Elisha doesn't show up at all in Chronicles. So really, really not interested in that. So as you guys see, history, or this idea of whether there are good kings and bad kings, is really just in the eye of the beholder. And the text doesn't really give you a clear understanding of it, though it is fairly clear that if you create larger categories, you can certainly separate kings as being good or fairly good, and then bad, and then some who are kind of in the middle. Like I would say David and Solomon are kind of gray kings. They're pretty good at times, but there are things that they've done that have been less than good. Hezekiah, a good king, gets quite a bit of notice in Chronicles compared to Kings, but he shows up quite a bit in Kings as well. Manasseh, really, really bad king. Does not follow in his father's footsteps. He kind of pretty much becomes the new Jeroboam. In the Deuteronomistic historian or history, all of the bad kings are compared to Jeroboam. They're like, oh, they followed in the steps of their father, which is really like their great grandfather, Jeroboam. But with Manasseh, it's like, yeah, he's a new example. He's a new paragon for horrible kings. And he doesn't get much discussion in either history, but Second Chronicles will record a repentance. So yeah, he was bad, but he repented. And the Deuteronomistic historian does not record a story of repentance at all. Josiah, both texts love Josiah. He initiates amazing reforms, and while First and Second Chronicles is interested in cultic reforms, is less Deuteronomistic, really more interested in the establishment of not just fidelity to God, but organization of the priesthood and things of that nature, which seem to be less important to the Deuteronomistic historian. Organization of the priesthood is less important than the oneness of God and the oneness of the people and the oneness of where they worship, and things like obedience. And last but not least, in Deuteronomistic history, you get two accounts. You get one that discusses the fall of the northern kingdom, which I discussed already. It occurs in 721 BCE. And one that accounts for the destruction of the southern kingdom, which occurs in 581 BCE, 586, BCE. First and Second Chronicles, not interested in the northern kingdom at all, does not mention their destruction at all, really just interested in the degradation of the southern kingdom and what leads to exile. very much interested in showing a narrative of what places the people in the position that they are in Second Chronicles 36, the last chapter, and also equally interested in restoring the people. So it ends not with a narrative of destruction like Second Kings 25, but ends with a proclamation of the people's freedom and release by Cyrus, a future proclamation that doesn't occur for many, many years after. So it ends with hope and restoration. Last but not least, these histories, as you can see, and I mean, I haven't even gone over much at all compared to everything that's there in these books. I didn't mention Uzziah at all, for example. Also quite favorable in some ways, and somewhat has actions that are absent in the Deuteromistic history. Nonetheless, the Deuteromistic history thinks of the legislation of Deuteronomy as important, and the lack of fealty to God is leading to exile, right? And so its narratives show degradation of both kingdoms and destruction of both lands. First and Second Chronicles is they're really loving the Davidic lineage. That's all they really care about. But they are seeing degradation in the southern kingdom too, and in the Davidic lineage. They are acknowledging that led to exile, but it's more so interested in leaving you with a message of hope and restoration, making the rewritten history of Chronicles more hopeful, more restorative, less heavy than the Deuteromistic history itself. Not only because the Deuteromistic history occurs in so many books of the Bible, and Chronicles just has 2, right? But because there is a deliberate aim to offer hope to a people who really, really needs it, really. There's a lot more we can say about Kings. So much more. And, we'll just give you a little bit of a taste here in this webinar. But we do very much discuss this a lot more in the Old Testament class, and it makes a lot more sense because you get to actually read this text and you get to actually, have a chance to place yourself in the text and think about it as a reader and kind of enmeshed in the world, or immersed, in the world of the ancient Israelites. But also because you get to read other books like Joshua and Judges is a book while full of really violent acts. It is a book that really kind of shows why the people needed a king, at the same time of warning them about what a king will do. And the Deuteromistic kings do very much what Judges and what Samuel the prophet warns the people of in 1 Samuel that a king will do, right? All of these things act as a rationale for the destruction that is to come. But it is nice that Chronicles offers, a more hopeful picture of that. So yes, I, in so many ways in this webinar, have not answered your question, or the initial question as to whether the biblical view of kings is good or bad. It is both. Not or, but and. And there are lots of reasons why, but you have to read more than just the accounts of these kings in the Bible to understand why. You have to understand Deuteronomy, and it helps to understand what's going on in the prophets as well. So I'll go ahead and conclude this webinar. And I want to conclude, as I always do, by letting you know what's going on here with ABI. I don't see any comments, so I'll just kind of move forward, but feel free to offer any comments or questions as I go through this, and I will answer them. So ABI Bible Institute that really encourages lifelong learning. Because of this, we offer new classes every single month. We also offer, things like grow plans that allow you to enroll in courses, every single month on a routine basis by making a fee, paying a fee every month for your classes. We also offer free webinars, at least 4 every single month. So, and we've offered more at some point in the month. So I'll say at least 4. This is one of those webinars, and this is specifically in the Interpretation Matter series, because interpretation does matter. And as you see here, it clearly matters. It also matters what you're reading and where you're reading. A lot of people would say, oh, the Bible says X, Y, and Z. And my question is always, where? What part of the Bible? Enlighten me. Because you can almost always find something that's tenuous somewhere else, right? And it's important. That tension is important. It in so many ways gets you in the mentality that you must continue to wrestle with what's there in the text, and to help you to understand that the pursuit of God is all about the pursuit of knowledge, the pursuit of understanding, the pursuit of wisdom, and that you can't quite capture who God is. And that's true of the world, but it's also true of the text. So do come to our webinars, come to our classes, and learn a bit more about that. Our next few webinars, we have one on whether homosexuality is acceptable in the Bible. I believe that one is this Saturday. That one will be a Real Talks webinar. We're not going to come to you with any notes, any PowerPoints. We're just going to kind of let you know what the text says and kind of do a brain dump on the topic, me and another instructor. And there's a webinar coming up soon after that, and I believe it is on entrepreneurship. So do come out. You can register for these webinars for free at our website, and you can join our live class and receive a text message to remind you when we are coming on. And you can also join on YouTube or Facebook. Last but not least, we do have new classes that are going to start next week. These classes are all really interesting in that each of them discusses the prophetic in one way or another in at least one session, which is interesting. I don't think we've ever done something like this as far as our classes, and it certainly was not intentional. Nonetheless, we're offering church administration. That class will be on Wednesdays at 6 for 1 hour. It's not church administration. It's actually Marketplace Ministry. This is the wrong flyer, so please forgive me. But same instructors will be teaching it, Professor Cord and Professor Miranda. Very much Marketplace Ministry, so there'll be a session discussing each of these ministerial gifts and their role in the marketplace. We're also offering the second part of prophetic artistry, the course itself, so it's 102. And you don't have to have taken prophetic artistry 101 to join the course. 102 is really going to focus on how we can utilize our potential, our gifts to, target a particular audience, and we're going to think creatively about that. We're also offering prophets and prophecy in the Bible. Really excited about that class. And Misreading Jesus and Paul, which will be Friday 7 to 8. All of these classes are 4-week classes, really short, once a week in real time in a private classroom. We're going to not record our classes. So you can say what you want, be as honest as you want, ask whatever you want, and get the questions that you have answered, and also expand in how you think about the text and about yourself. So do register for these classes. These courses are $70 if you pay for them just by course, but you can also pay for them by session. I believe if you just want to come into one session, for example, you want to come in when we're talking about, you know, what is prophecy itself in the Prophets and Prophecy class, you can register for the first or the second session and just pay a fee for that one session. Or you can enroll in one of our Grow Plans or certificate programs, and you can register for these courses as little as, I believe, $44 a month. So do let us know if you have questions and do register. I don't see any questions on any of our platforms, so I'm going to wish you guys a great night. Have a nice day. Bye.